It's been all over the news. Justin's House of Bourbon and BourbonOutfitters.com was raided. Want to know what the heck happened? Then stick around. So before we get started, I would like to take a moment to thank all of the Patreons who help make this show possible. If you are not a Patreon member, I'd love for you to consider it. We have some awesome stuff coming up. We are doing a barrel pick in Houston in April. Everybody at the collector tier is going to be invited to that. Everybody that's part of Patreon is going to get a shot at getting one of those bottles. We have monthly virtual bottle shares. We have bonus content. We have discounts on merch, Patreon exclusive challenge coin if you're into that kind of thing, and just the satisfaction in knowing that you're supporting the channel and its mission. And if you would consider, the link is in the description below. Now, let's get into the disclaimers. First thing that you need to know is that my brand, The Prideful Goat, uses Bourbon Outfitter as its online shipping retailer. You also need to know that I love Bourbon Outfitters and I am extremely biased and I would not want to do or say anything that would harm them. And so just keep all of that in mind. I am not quite qualified to provide legal analysis. I am just reporting the information that I've been able to gather about the situation, and I will provide some of my opinions, but you need to know they're just that. They're my opinions. They are not legal advice. You need to go out and do your own research and come to your own conclusion. Also, please note that I'm going to be talking about several states in the United States and Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, and I'm aware that D.C. is not a state. So if I use the word states in reference to D.C., I am sorry. I've already done it once in another video and someone called me on it. Now, let's talk about the background of what's going on in this story. So Justin's House of Bourbon is a legally licensed liquor retailer in Kentucky that has two separate locations. Bourbon Outfitter is a legally licensed liquor retailer in Washington, D.C. with no storefront that only offers online sales. And both establishments have the exact same ownership. So there are three individuals and they own three liquor stores, two in Kentucky, one in Washington, D.C. The other thing that you need to know is that Kentucky and DC have very different retailer regulations. So there are things that are illegal in one place that would be illegal in the other, and that is the crux of this case. So Kentucky retailers are allowed to buy bottles from the public at large and resell them. And that is very, very unique. Typically, once a bottle is in the three-tier system, it can only go through any of the elements of the three-tier system one time. And once it makes it to the public, it can't go back into the loop. But in Kentucky, as long as a bottle complies with the Kentucky Vintage Spirits Law, which has a very loose definition for what a vintage spirit is, they can repurchase it. And if you want more information about that, we did an amazing piece with Brad Bonds. It's called Where to Find Vintage Whiskey. And we kind of featured Brad Bond's vintage liquor store that's called revivalky.com. But we go into details about the vintage liquor law. But that law is going to come into play very heavily as we discuss what's going on with these three retail locations. In all states, retailers can only purchase liquor from wholesalers, except in DC, which again, not a state, they are authorized to purchase directly from producers. And so that's different. Typically you have a producer, you have a wholesaler, you have a retailer, and then you have bars and restaurants and consumers, right? And typically producers can only sell to wholesalers, but in DC they have different laws, and that is going to come into play very heavily as we try to understand this. And another thing that's super unique about DC is that they are authorized to ship bottles from their DC location to states when the customer orders online. And that is not the case anywhere else. And so that is another element that's going to play heavily in understanding what's going on. So on January the 17th, 2023, Justin's House of Bourbon and Bourbon Outfitters were raided, and hundreds of bottles of premium bourbons were placed in voluntary detention. And the details are laid out in a report that was filed in Washington, D.C., where the district regulators were working with Kentucky, Texas, Pennsylvania, and federal alcohol agents on the case. The Kentucky ABC will not release information while the investigation is going on. So I was able to find a media report where they used the laws allowing them to request documents from government agencies. They requested it from both Kentucky and DC. DC complied, Kentucky did not. All this information comes from the DC report. So, in the report, they claim that there have been 11 code violations, including illegally transporting alcohol into the District of Columbia and unlawfully obtaining products from outside of the United States. So, according to the case report, Kentucky ABC agents visited the Lexington store to buy a bottle and to ask to send it out of state, but the owner said that it couldn't be done. The agents proceeded to open up the bottle and share it with the owner. And a short time later, the owner came back and advised the agents that he could drive the bottle to Washington, D.C. and ship it wherever they liked. And that kicked off an inquiry into Justin's House of Bourbon and their shipping practices to D.C. After this, and it was a sting operation. They went there to catch them doing something wrong. They pretended to be customers. They bought a bottle. They shared the bottle with the store's proprietor, and they got him to say that he had the ability to send it to his DC location and then ship it. So after the sting operation, Kentucky alcohol beverage control officers contacted the DC alcohol investigators about shipments that were coming from Kentucky to DC. On November 10th, DC investigators visited Bourbon Outfitters to conduct a regulatory inspection. And while they were there, they were talking to some of the employees. One of the employees said that Bourbon Outfitters transports alcohol from the retail locations in Kentucky to DC to sell online and to ship nationally. And the employee confirmed that they were transporting 500 cases of Blanton's into the district that weekend, and that the product was coming in from the Netherlands from a retailer named musthavemalts.com. And this brought up concerns that some of the products could be counterfeit, because investigators ended up contacting Sazerac and informed them that there were these 500 bottles that were coming in and trying to figure out where they came from. And Sazerac told the investigators that they have been looking into a bootleg operation that's been creating counterfeit bottles in the Netherlands, which obviously is a major point of concern, and that they didn't have any records of sales of a volume large enough that any one retailer could have had 500 cases of Blanton's, which makes it even that much more suspect. Now, to be clear, Justin's House of Bourbon and Bourbon Outfitters are not implicated as counterfeiters. There's no indication that they had any idea that these products were fake, but it did become a concern that got brought up once the investigators started talking with Sazerac. Also, Pennsylvania officials have been brought into this investigation because they are trying to track down where 600 bottles of Weller Special Reserve came from that were allegedly sent from Pennsylvania to Justin's House of Bourbon. And it appears to be like a shell corporation that owned the bottles called Star Liquidation, and they don't have any licensing. They're not a wholesaler. They don't have an import permit. And Justin's House of Bourbon has been ordered to appear in a show cause hearing in DC. So that's kind of the culmination of all this stuff. They're trying to figure out, hey, did you illegally transport? Have you been illegally shipping things? Have you been illegally buying bottles? And we want you to come to a hearing. We want you to present your side. They're going to decide whether or not they are going to charge them with any crimes and what's going to happen with their licensing as a result of this investigation. So when they go to the show cause hearing for why they should not be found liable for the violations, they'll get their chance to kind of lay their case out. No charges have been filed yet. Justin's House of Bourbon remains open and licensed in the state of Kentucky, and Bourbon Outfitters is still open and operating in DC. So what does all of this mean, and what is at issue? So it appears to me that Justin's House of Bourbon was using the Kentucky vintage spirits law to acquire desirable bottles. Then they were transporting them to Bourbon Outfitters, their DC location, and using DC shipping laws to sell them online. I'm unsure whether or not the Kentucky vintage spirits law allows the retailer to purchase bottles outside of Kentucky, and if they do that, if they're authorized to have the bottles shipped into the store by common carrier. And if they're not allowed to do that, who and what relationship does the person picking the bottles up have to have for it to be compliant with the acquisition process of the Kentucky vintage spirits law?
So, Randy, which one of the Still Austin whiskeys is your favorite?
It's like picking between my kids, man.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. Originally, I got to try the Musician when it first came out. Came in this beautiful wooden tube. It was a 375, really knocked my socks off.
Yeah.
And then they hit me with a cash strength version, and I was like, lights out. This is hands down the best Kentucky-esque bourbon to come out of the state of Texas. No doubt.
Yeah.
Then I go to Whiskey Riot, and they got a table, and I get to try their rye whiskey.
Ooh.
And now I can't decide which one is my favorite.
You know how we are such proof hounds. I gotta lean toward the cash strength personally, even though it is very hard to say. The rye is, for a non-rye guy, I love it. It doesn't overpower you with that rye spice, but it's still well balanced to where it comes through. Man, it is hard to choose. So why don't you choose for yourself? Next time that you're out and about, look for Still Austin on the shelf, because you will not be disappointed with those big, bold flavors coming out of the Lone Star State of Texas.
That's right. Why don't you pick up the whole lineup and let us know what you think?
You can thank us later.
Still Austin, Bourbon Real Talk approved. To have a bottle shipped to your door or find a retailer, click the link in the video description.
The other thing I'm unsure about is if DC retailers are authorized to purchase product from other retailers. Because remember, we already covered the fact that they are allowed to buy direct from producers, which is unique and in the District of Columbia. I want to know whether or not it is lawful for them to buy directly from other retail stores. And if it's not, would it be lawful for a person who legally owned liquor stores in two different states to transfer inventory between one another? And if they say that it's not legal, does that violate the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution, right? Because obviously they would be interfering with that business's ability to operate because of different laws in different states. So when you look at it from the 10,000 foot view, you've got a group of investors who own 3 liquor stores. One state they're allowed to buy from the public at large with no licensing. Another state they're allowed to advertise and market online and ship bottles out of state. And it looks like they were just trying to use these 2 unique laws to basically recreate the secondary market. We used to be able, as consumers, to trade bottles between one another on one large platform on Facebook called Bourbon Secondary Market, and the government ended up shutting it down after the Van Winkles went to them and said, hey, this is all illegal, we want you to make this stop, our products are being bootlegged. And once that got shut down, enterprising people like the individuals that own these 3 liquor stores were trying to find ways to provide that service to the public legally. That's what it looks like to me. Now, we would know whether or not this was 100% legit if I had clear answers about whether or not they're purchasing a product from an overseas retailer was lawful, right? Because I know that if you walk into their store and say, hey, I have this bottle and it's a vintage bottle and I'll sell it to you, they're allowed to buy it. They're allowed to register that bottle with the state, and they're allowed to sell it as a retail establishment. I don't know if they're allowed to find a bottle overseas and have it shipped. And I'm also unsure about whether or not that transporting between different businesses is allowed. And so I actually called ABRA, which is the regulatory authority in DC, and I said, hey, I'm doing a piece on the differences in your laws in DC, and I need to speak with somebody who can give me an answer. And they transferred me to an investigator, and I said, I'm aware that if you are legally licensed as a retailer in the District of Columbia, you are allowed to buy directly from producers if the producer does not have a wholesaler in the district. But I'm wondering whether or not a licensee is authorized to purchase from retailers outside of the district. And the person who's supposed to be an investigator said to me, and I quote, I think that they're supposed to buy from a wholesaler. And the point that I'm trying to make is that this is the fundamental difference between the laws in DC and the rest of the country. And their investigator doesn't even know the very basics of what is allowed and what's not allowed in their area. And the point that I'm trying to make is it is entirely plausible that you could be the owner of Justin's House of Bourbon and Bourbon Outfitters and be trying to find actual legitimate answers to some of these questions, and no one can definitively tell you. It is very common to call a state ABC and ask what you think is a simple question, and they can't get anyone on the phone that can give you a straight answer. And I've seen that happen in multiple states, including having to get a supervisor on the phone at the TTB when they wouldn't approve one of our labels for light whiskey because the proof wasn't high enough, because they didn't understand the difference between distillation proof, barrel entry proof, and bottling proof. And we literally had to get a person on the phone that was a supervisor to train somebody else the difference between those 3 proof points. And those are the people who determine whether or not the labels get approved or not. So as somebody who's trying to legally operate, it can be a little bit difficult to know for sure what the truth is. So what I want everybody to walk away with this understanding is that it is entirely possible that Justin's House of Bourbon and Bourbon Outfitters believed that everything that they were doing was absolutely legal. And it's entirely possible, and I would say even likely, that if it turns out that they had counterfeit products, that they had no clue that the bottles were fake. There's no indication at all that there's any sort of a conspiracy, that they thought that they were doing anything wrong. I don't think that they were trying to defraud anybody. I think that what is happening is they are trying to exploit some differences in laws to try and create an opportunity for us, the consumers, and now the ABC is taking issue with it. So takeaways, in my opinion, the only reason this even happened is because bourbon secondary market got shut down. If BSM were still going, there probably wouldn't be very much money to be made in this type of operation, because you're adding cost at every step of the way that used to not exist in the system. The other thing is that the 3-tier system does 2 things well, and this case highlights it. And, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think it's time for us to start having some discussions about what we can do to fix the 3-tier system problems. And we need to make sure that these 2 things continue to be done well. And the first thing is the 3-tier system is great at collecting state taxes. And anytime you start talking about, changing the 3-tier system, that is the big concern for regulators, or how are we going to make sure that we get our taxes? And the other thing that the 3-tier system is pretty good at doing is keeping fake bottles off of the market, because there has to be a paper trail of transfer of ownership. And if somebody gets caught with a fake bottle in their possession, it's going to come to light that they had to falsify records and all that stuff, and they're going to actually go to jail. And for that reason, we need to make sure that consumers are protected from fakes entering into the market, no matter what we do with the 3-tier system. I'd also like to point out that it is common for an argument to be made about safety for the consuming public whenever you start talking about changing 3-tier system laws. They're like, hey, we have to make sure that this stuff doesn't end up in the wrong hands and all that stuff. And that whole argument is a red herring argument, okay? They allow us to ship dangerous and potentially lethal medications all over the country to houses, along with many other potentially dangerous products that you can just order on Instacart and have shipped to your house. And if they can figure out how to make that and medications reasonably safe for the public, they can figure out how to make alcohol shipping safe as well. It's just that, right now there's too many interested parties that make too much money keeping it the way that it is. So if we want to make sure that taxes are collected, all we have to do is allow shipping from any level of the tier, but anybody who's going to ship into a state should have to register to be a shipper and report their volume just like everybody else does and pay their taxes. And through that process, and obviously there's going to have to be some regulatory authority there to bust people who are trying to work their way around it and not paying their taxes, but that's a common problem in the alcohol industry. And the other thing that I think we need to do to prevent fakes from entering into the market is that we need to make it so that consumers are allowed to sell alcohol to one another, okay? Right now, technically, the transfer of alcohol from one private citizen to another with no licensee involved is technically against the rules. And I don't think that makes any sense. We're allowed to sell guns to each other, people. Guns. They are far more dangerous than a bottle of alcohol. And so if we can figure out a way to do that and give people the right to do that, people should have the right to sell alcohol to each other. But I do not think, and I'm sorry, Kentucky, I understand why the vintage spirits law became necessary, because the secondary market, the only way to fight it is to bring licensed individuals back into the transfer of that alcohol. But I don't think that it's good for the consumers in the grand scheme of things. I think that once a bottle gets into the hands of a consumer, consumers can sell it to each other, and you can know as a consumer that it might be a fake, and you can take that risk with your money because you're a free American, and that's what you can do. But I don't think that you should be able to sell it back into the 3-tier system again. I think that is what makes it dangerous. And the incentive for these businesses to get a hold of large quantities of this rare whiskey that are so valuable right now is probably what's driving whatever fake market is out there, because there's just so much money in making these fake bottles. And right now, with the way that things are, it's possible for fakes to enter their way into the system. So if we made these changes, would it shake up our system? Yes. Would some businesses suffer? Yes. Would others blossom? Absolutely. But in the end, everything would work itself out, and we would have a free market where everyone who made it did so by providing the best product or service to the consuming public, instead of the government picking winners and losers based on who has the biggest lobby, which, by the way, that's how it happens now. So I just want to thank you for tuning in. I hope this was informative for you. And if this is your first time watching the show, I want to tell you about our show philosophy. We here at Bourbon Real Talk are all about bringing people together around spirits. And that's something that's personally important to me because I lost my brother to suicide in 2014. And in the aftermath of his passing, I was trying to find ways to increase community and connection, because I came to understand that he had started to feel very disconnected from the world around him, and that's what made it easy for him to say goodbye to it. And so I figure if I can get you connected to whiskey, whiskey will do the rest of the job and get you connected to others. And that's why we have Bourbon Real Talk community. It's a place for like-minded individuals to go and make connections, many times with people that you probably otherwise wouldn't have connected with because you had ideological differences. But when the whiskey is the thing that's bringing people together, all that stuff seems to not matter so much anymore. And as I started down this path of trying to create connection and community in whiskey, I did see the negative side of the enthusiast community, and that is whiskey trolls. A lot of people saying hateful things to strangers online. But that did make me realize that if those individuals can show hate to you online, even though they don't really know you, there's nothing that keeps me from loving you online, even though I don't really know you. And that's why I end every show the same way, and that's this. If you woke up this morning and you were unsure whether or not anyone loved you, just know that I love you. And I'll see you next time on Bourbon Real Talk. Live, rolling. We got sound.
You got sound?
We got video.
Video.
Sound and video. Both crucial elements of producing a good YouTube video. So it's been all over the news. Justin's House of Bourbon and BourbonOutfitters.com has been raided. Want to know what the heck happened? Well, that's gonna have to go into bloopers. Anyway, so it's been all over the news. I shouldn't say so. That's dumb. That'll be done.
I knew I was a bigger Bourbon Real Talk fan than you.
How do you know that?
Well, because I don't just use a prideful goat, Glenn. I got an official Bourbon Real Talk tumbler.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I got this Bourbon Real Talk lanyard to carry my whiskey glass in.
Oh, well, speaking of whiskey glasses, do you have one of these?
No, I don't.
Rocks glass.
Oh, yeah?
Yep, official.
Well, I love my wife, and I bought her this official whiskey wife flask from Bourbon Real Talk.
Well, that's cute and everything, but I got my wife one of these.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Well,
You can just add your own liquor, and it's an actual cocktail right there in a jar.
Me and my wife like to make cocktails, so we got this simple syrup off
Oh,
the website.
do you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you and your wife have one of these? This is an official sticker. You can only get these on the website.
No, but I do have these official coasters that have the Bourbon Real Talk logo on them, and I'm representing.
Well, while you're representing those little coasters of yours, I've got an aroma kit.
Do you?
Yeah, so I can smell literally everything in bourbon. Everything.
Well, I don't have that, but I do have this sample box that I keep all my samples in because I'm part of the community and I share samples.
Yeah, but do you have Glen toppers that are officially Bourbon Real Talk?
I don't have that, but I do have this large whiskey carrying case for my glasses so that I don't break them.
See, I knew you had that. That's why I have this, the smaller version, okay? It packs more easily into your suitcase. Don't have to mess with that big old thing, okay?
Suitcase, that's for lamos. Check this thing out. I have a Bourbon Real Talk bottle carrying bag. You can't beat that.
I don't know if I can because.
And on top of that, I have a Bourbon Real Talk t-shirt. I'm the bigger fan.
Oh, I can beat that. Is it extra schmedium?
No, I don't have an extra medium.
Ha! Extra schmedium.
You might be the bigger fan. You win.
I knew it.
So whether you're a Bourbon Real Talk superfan or simply looking for quality whiskey swag, head over to bourbonrealtalk.com today.